And I don't know if I'm going to get a notification that it's recording.
Yes, we are recording.
Cool, great, perfect. So my name is Bersi Edvardsson, also known as Bear Goodson mundanely. And this is going to be Old Norse poetry, a very crash course straight into it. We're going to quickly, just so you know what we're going to do today, hopefully we'll get through all of it. So we've got an Old Norse crash course, as in the language itself. A bit about meter and form of Old Norse poetry. We're going to look at kennings and heiti, which are the sort of staple of the Old Norse poetic forms. And then we're going to look at an example. It says more than one. That's false. All right, so a little bit more about me before we get going. I joined the SCA when I was 14, which was in 2012, and y'all can do the math on that one. I'm from the Principality of the Mists and the Kingdom of the West. And just this past spring, I completed my degree in Scandinavian Studies with a focus in Old Norse from UC Berkeley. And this time last year, I took a graduate level course in Old Norse poetry. And that's what I'm basing most of my information on. But I am far from an expert in this field. I'm just more knowledgeable than the average person. And that's me at 12th Night last year, my last in-person SCA event, and in Norway this spring, right before I had to come back very suddenly from studying abroad. So let's get right into it. That's enough about me. Chapter 1, Kapituling 1, Old Norse crash course. What is Old Norse? Well, it's the language that the Vikings or medieval Scandinavians spoke. It was used in various forms from the 8th to the 15th centuries. And it is a Germanic language, so it's a close cousin of English. This chart here is a very basic chart of the Germanic family tree of the Indo-European languages. Here's English over on the far left at the bottom, and what's in this chart as West Scandinavian and East Scandinavian taken together is what we call Old Norse. And you can see how we're pretty close. We're pretty well related to them. And there's a lot of cross-contamination that happens between languages. As for pronunciation, because this is something that a lot of people ask about, so you can say the names correctly and all that. There are two sort of schools of thought on how Old Norse should be pronounced. There's modern Icelandic pronunciation, where you just it's exactly what it sounds like. You just pronounce it as if it's modern Icelandic. And I would tell you how that looks, except I don't speak modern Icelandic, and I have trouble with this double L, KL, TL thing. There's some interesting differences, but for the most part, modern Icelandic sounds very, very similar to Old Norse reconstruction, where which is what linguists through historical linguistics have sort of cobbled together what we think Old Norse might have sounded like, kind of more of a Western Icelandic Old Norse, though, not exactly what, like, for instance, Swedish Old Norse would sound like. And absolutely, Kinnahild, historical linguistics represent. So the pronunciation of Old Norse, I've put in these very long charts and lists, and you can take a look at them, but I've also pulled out the weird stuff, the things that usually will trip people up. So J's usually have the Y sound, so that's so like in the word fjord, FJORD, right? The J makes a Y sound. F's make the F sound at the beginning of words, but in the middle of words make more of a V sound. So for instance, the dragon who in modern English pronunciation, I might say his name is Fafnir, Fafnir, would have actually been full near, right? So F at the beginning, f, and then v in the middle. R's are slightly trilled, sort of like a Scottish R. So instead of Thor, it's Thor. I know it's very difficult probably on the computer to actually pick up, but I'm very slightly, it's like a harder, slightly trilled R. And now the funny looking characters. That's the things that are a little different. I'm not going to go very deep into the vowels, although generally you can say that the vowels are like a, e, o, u. And then there's some extra ones we'll get into in a second. But for those funny looking characters, we've got thorn, which is this odd P with a hat, or a B and a P slammed together, a long line with a bump. And the thorn is the TH sound that you find in the word breath. It's not vocalized, if that's the correct term. Whereas eth, which is this next letter, it looks like a D with a line through it, is also a TH sound, but it's the TH sound in breathe. So and yes, I have made, great question. I've made this slideshow shareable. Actually, I can grab the link really fast. I'll just drop it in right now, and then you guys can even follow along. So this is viewable by anybody. So the thorn makes the sound that it says in its name, thorn, and eth, eth, right? So breathe and breath and breathe, rather, the other way around. Ash, this AE ligature, makes, again, the sound that its name says, ash, just like the tree, or when you burn things, ash. But it makes, and so it makes the A sound in cat, ah, ah. This is different than if you're used to reading this ligature in Latin. Classical Latin pronunciation has this I. So get that out of your head. It is not Aesir, it's Asir, right? So the name of the gods, Ash, I can't spell out loud, I'm so bad at this. Ash, S-I-R, is not Aesir, but Aesir, or Asir rather, cat, Asir. This /O, or the OE ligature, makes the French sound. I think of it kind of as like if you were a posh English person saying the word bird, the I in bird, bird, I don't know. It's close. It's somewhere in there. And let's be real, no one needs to actually understand you if you're speaking Old Norse. There are no current Old Norse speakers. So as long as you get close to these sort of things, people will understand what you mean. There's going to be a lot, by the way, going forward in this that I won't actually be able to talk about. I've put a lot more information on my slides than I'll be able to actually say. So I highly recommend that you go back and look at these later. 1 hour is only so long to get through things with Old Norse poetry. Here's just a quick list of some Old Norse or English words that are Old Norse in origin. As you can see, I was going down a list from Wikipedia. There's a wealth of great Wikipedia lists out there. And I only got down to K, picking and choosing things before I was like, all right, that's too many. There's a huge number of words. Things like aloft, which is from lopt, in and the air. Oh, lovely. I'm just reading Elsa's. Perfect, great. Extra time, hee. Things like anger from unger. I love this one. It does mean bark, as in like the tree bark, but I think it's kind of funny to think about a dog, because the Old Norse word is borker. But yeah, also one of my favorite Old Norse words is egg, from egg, meaning egg. Just to wrap up, finally getting to the end of our sort of intro to Old Norse as a language, we need to talk a little tiny bit about cases and word order and what that sort of does for us grammatically. We won't go very far into it. We won't be like memorizing conjugation and declension today. No way. Just sort of like to understand what's going on. This out of my way. There we go. So in English, when we want to, what language is supposed to just, you're supposed to communicate information, right? That's what language is for. And in English, when we want to communicate more information about verbs, we use conjugation. Most, I would say all, I don't know, these are unsubstantiated claims, but I would say all Indo-European languages use conjugation in some form. Basically, this means you can tell more information about like who is doing the action, when the action is taking place, and whether or not it's completed. Those are time, person, and aspect, respectively. So I walk, I walked. That tells you what time it happened. I am walking tells you whether that is a completed or an ongoing action. So that's what conjugation does, right? And then, of course, you can also say, you know, I walk, he, she, it walks, right? So changing for person. Well, nouns you need to know different information about too, right? The kind of information you might want to know about a noun is if it's the subject of the sentence, or the object, or the indirect object, or if it's a possessive. And that's where cases come in. In English, we use word order. We say, okay, it needs to be the subject, then the verb, then the object. The dog ate the cat is a very different sentence than the cat ate the dog, right? Placing the first, you know, the subject in the first position is very important in English. But in Old Norse, they don't use, there is word order that typically happens, and it is actually very similar to English word order, but they use cases as well so that the word order doesn't matter that much. So they change the ending of the nouns to tell you whether or not it's the subject or the object or the indirect object, or if it's a possessive, and also some more complicated things, but mainly those things. And if you take a look, this is my own, I took a picture, this is my own morphology sheet that's beaten all to hell and written all over. But it has information about how to decline nouns. And you can see there's nominative, NAGD along all the edges. That's nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative, the four cases in Old Norse, corresponding in order to roughly subject, object, possessive, or yes, and indirect object. This is very important. This is sorry, reading can help the joke. Yes, good. This is very important to know that they have cases and that word order can be messed around with, because boy, do they mess around with word order in poetry. And that is what makes it so dang difficult to translate. It's because none of the words are in the right spot. So that's our quick crash course through the language, and I'm glad to see where we're at with time. So let's talk a little bit about meter and form, which is really the meat of what we're doing here. So Old Norse poetry is broken up into two major groups, Eddic, pretty arbitrarily though. So it's Eddic poetry and skaldic poetry. Eddic, the word Edda refers to, there are two works. There's the poetic Edda and the prose Edda, or otherwise known as Snorra Edda, or simply just Edda. And we don't know exactly what the word Edda means. Most people ask that. It might mean grandmother, but it's not exactly clear. It still would be an odd thing to call these works if it was called grandmother. But the Eddic poems are poems that are found in the Poetic Edda, and a couple of poems that are kind of like it. Skaldic poetry is everything else. It's a pretty easy distinction. Some of the other things that just that line up with that are that Eddic poetry, we don't know who wrote them. We don't have authorship for any Eddic poems. Whereas Skaldic poetry, we almost always know who the author is, or at least we have a name. There some of the famous Eddic poems. Oh, and by the way, the word skald, I realized I didn't talk about this. A skald is a poet, a performer of poetry, a composer and performer of poetry in medieval Scandinavia. That is what skald means. Some famous Eddic poems, other than just the entire Poetic Edda, are the Havamal and Lokasenna and things like that. Skaldic poems, there are far more of them than Eddic poetry, and of Skaldic poems, the vast majority are Drakthait, which is everyone's favorite Skaldic poetic form, and also one of the most complicated. We'll be taking a specific look at that form in a little bit. That's the one form I'm really going to bring to the forefront. All the other ones are much simpler and can be pretty easily understood once you know the sort of more complex one. 15% or so are Kviduhatter, and less than 25% are Hrinhent, but it's a very important form because it's a modification. It's sort of like the successor in popularity to Drakthait. And just as a quick mention, my favorite poem, which we're not going to look at today because it's so long, it's a Draupa, which is a long form poem, is Sonatorek, which is from Egil Saga, and it's attributed to Egil Skallagrimsson, and it's in a Kviduhatter verse, and I highly recommend you read it. It is heart-wrenching and beautiful. Sonatorek means of the loss of my sons. But in any case, I'm so I hope I'm not. Let me know if I'm moving too fast. I'm worried about time, so I've been sort of moving along at a clip. But like, if you need me to repeat something or go over something again, please let me know or ask questions. Let's get into a little bit about the what's the word, like the I can't think of the poetic term for this. You know what I mean? Like the things, the elements of this poetry that really make it Old Norse poetry, other than just like syllable count. Alliteration is used everywhere. It's very much you will see this as well if you've read Beowulf, if you know Anglo-Saxon poetry. You're very used to like, oh, alliteration is super important. Alliteration, as Merriam-Webster Dictionary says, is the repetition of usually initial consonant sounds in two or more neighboring words or syllables. There's something special to note about Old Norse, however. Consonants have to alliterate with themselves, of course, but all vowels alliterate with all other vowels in Old Norse. So I's and A's and E's and ash and hook O and slash O, they all alliterate with each other. But it has to be the first letter of the word. So some Old Norse examples, straight from, we're going to be looking in particular at one poem, and I've used pretty much all of my examples are just drawn from that same poem so that we can really get a good look at it. So we've got, I've underlined where the alliteration falls in this verse, or in these 2 lines. So I'll read it out loud. Krupen ver fyr vopna, valtegsbröken egi. It goes on. This is just a couple of lines, but you can see here, ver vopna valtegs. We'll go into why they are in the positions that they are, but you can see this is all alliterating. And here's an English example that let's see if I can do it. Peter Piper picked a pickled pepper. Whoop, I'm already messed up. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. A peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked. If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, where's the peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked? Alliteration. In addition to alliteration, Old Norse poetry is sometimes, and especially Dagfight, some of the more complex forms have rules about adelhending and skothending. I'm realizing I'm not sure if I actually made a mention in the pronunciation part that the first syllable of every word in Old Norse is what usually gets the emphasis. So if you're not sure where you should be emphasizing, go for position 1. So it's adelhending and skothending. Adelhending means full rhymes. It's exactly the way that you were taught rhymes in school. Usually English does this as end rhymes. So that means the last syllables of a word. I realize I've used examples that are single syllable words, dog and bog, child and mild. But let's see. It's like when you're asked your favorite book and you forget all books you've ever read. I'm trying to think of a rhyme. Ones that have multiple syllables. Oh well, whatever. Anyway, the point is that in Old Norse, it doesn't necessarily have to be at the very end of the word. So as you see here, Haldor and Skjaldar rhyme with each other. And Hjelmstall and Malma rhyme with each other because they have a vowel and then its immediately preceding consonants are all the same. ALM, ALM, ALD, ALD. And actually, usually they are not end rhymes in Old Norse. There are some weird exceptions, but usually it's just somebody showing off, like the Lilja poet, who Kinnahild would recognize. Thank you, Kinnahild. There once was a man from Nantucket who kept all his cash in a bucket. His daughter named Jan married a man. And what of the cash? Well, Nantucket. Thank you, Kinnahild. Oh, well. Sorry. But thank you. Yes. So those are all end rhymes. Whereas in Old Norse, they can be in the middle as well as at the end. Skothending is half rhymes, which is a little weird. I feel it takes a little while to like start hearing them because we're very used to in English needing that vowel sound to be correct, right? We really want the vowels to match. But a half rhyme is where the vowels are different, but the following consonants are the same. So things that would rhyme in this way in English are helps and alps, wander and pending, believe it or not, because ond and end half rhyme. And in Old Norse, here's a couple of examples. Svo baud hilder at hjaldri. Ild and ald half rhyme with each other. And again, hlakkar is och hausar. Is and aus half rhyme with each other. So that's adelhending and skothending. And then I have this very, very long list of other terms that you might like to know that I pulled all from Diana Whaley's I can't remember the name of the text, but it's her Old Norse poetry book. This is a direct quote. I just didn't put the quotations. I would like to sort of highlight here, and I did, Helmingar, which plural is Helmingar, which are half stanzas. There are 2 Helmingar in each stanza of Old Norse poetry almost every single time. And most of the time, each Helmingar is 4 lines. So most Old Norse poems have 8 lines with 2 Helmingar, half stanzas. Most of these words, most of this list, by the way, are different kinds of Old Norse poetry. So if you are trying to get into something that is a little bit less complicated than Throckfight to sort of start with, if you want to try to write things on your own, I really recommend looking through this list. And for instance, Hrinhent is a more simplified version. And let's see. Forny of this log is also very simple. It's one of the most simple meters. So this is a really good list to look through if you want to look things up. Wikipedia has really comprehensive like rules listed. So that's why I really wanted to include this list. Another couple of good terms to know. We're going to talk a little bit about reket, which means driven, and refers to a kind of kenning, and I'm going to talk about kennings just a second from now. And tvikent is another, is basically reket but smaller. So, or rather, reket is tvikent but chained on and on and on. And I'll talk about those in a minute as well. Before we get into KT and kennings, Throckfight. This is everyone's favorite skaldic meter. It was the most popular of its time. 60% of all skaldic poems that we have today are in this meter. It's also super complex and intricate, has very complicated rules. Good question. Is there a Viking haiku? Unfortunately, no. But if you enjoy counting syllables, Throckfight is the thing for you. Every line of its 8 lines has 6 syllables per line. And I said 2 to 3, but usually it's 3 strong positions or stressed syllables. Usually it's fairly trochaic, and the last syllable per line has to be a trochee. And a trochee, so you know, is a stressed and then an unstressed syllable. It's the opposite of an iamb, if that helps, right? So an iamb is unstressed, unstressed. Trochee is stressed and then unstressed. And if you remember what I said about Old Norse pronunciation, that the first syllable of every word is the stressed syllable, you know that all you need for Old Norse, for this kind of poem to work in Old Norse, is to get a 2-syllable word, right? Because they're always going to be trochees. That is one of the ways in which the language of Old Norse really aids in the writing of Old Norse poetry, because it is much harder to find words that'll do this correctly in English, and also still make your everything else fit correctly and have a cohesive thought conveyed. Odd lines, so lines 1, 3, 5, etc., have 2 stressed syllables that alliterate with each other, and 2 stressed syllables that display skothending or half rhymes. And then the even lines have the first stressed syllable of that line will alliterate with the alliterating syllables in the previous odd line. And there will be 2 stressed syllables that have full rhymes or adelhending. So it's a lot. There's a lot going into this. let's take a look at this verse right here, which is Harald Hardrada, Harald III of Norway. This is I know our thing is Hastings locked, but I like to think of it as Battle of Stamford Bridge locked. This is a verse that supposedly King Harold said on the battlefield shortly before his death. And I am having trouble getting my thing out of the way so I can read. There we go. So you might recognize these lines. This is what we've been using so far. So Krypum ver fyr vopna, Valtigsbröken eigi. All right, so ver vopna Valtigs. You can see there's the alliteration 1, 2 in the odd line, and then the first of the next line alliterates. Svo bald Hilder at Hjaldri, Haldor, right? So we got Hilder, Hjaldri, Haldor. Let's take a look at so that's the alliteration. You can follow that all the way through. For the Scott Hending, the half, actually I think I made, no I didn't. All right, so the half rhymes here, or the half rhymes here are, let's see, right here. Yes, so I believe the UP, and the OP, AP, those have a half rhyme with each other. Whereas in the next line, we have eggs, part of Valtegs, which full rhymes with eigi, right? EIG, EIG. And you can do that with every single line. These two are actually just so beautiful because they've managed to half rhyme. So ild and ald, Hilder and Hjaldri, right? So they have a half rhyme here, ild and ald, and then the next line full rhymes with that last. So Haldor and Skjaldar. That doesn't have to happen, but it's just the poet being, this is where poets can get like fancy with it. I love seeing when they like do unnecessary and more rhyming than they actually need to be doing. So that's Drottbite. I know it's sort of a lot. Does anyone have any specific questions about this meter before I move on? Cool. I'm gonna go then. So, Kapitel 3, number 3, Kennings and Haiti. They get their whole own section because they're so important to how Old Norse poetry looks and works and feels. We'll start with Haiti, a name by any other name, quite literally. In Haiti is a poetic synonym. It comes from the verb heita, which means to call. It is the typical word you would use to say somebody was called, like named something. So quite literally, Haiti means name or something that somebody is called. But it is a name by any other name than the one you're going for. You're referring to something, but you cannot use its actual name to refer to it. You use anything else, and it has to be just one element. That's what a Haiti is. One element. And by the way, the singular and plural for Haiti is Haiti. For instance, as Diana Whaley said here, it's an alternative and often descriptive term or name for a frequently occurring object or person mentioned in skaldic poetry. Example, brim, surf. Brim is the Old Norse word, to clarify. Brim, which means surf, or salt, which means salt, which are both Haiti, that means sea, right? You refer to a portion of it to refer to the whole. just the salt or just the surf or maybe just the waves. But by saying waves, I mean the sea. Or for instance, any of the various different, there's like a billion names for Odin. So Ygr is one of them. That's an alternative name for the god Odin. These are all things that are called heiti. They're very similar to epithets in like Greek and Roman epic poetry, right? Actually, I don't know about Roman poetry at all, so I take that one out. Greek poetry, I do know there's epithets in there. So here's some examples. House, which means skull, to refer to the head. Here's some more names for Odin. There's Allfather, which means all father. Forni, which means ancient one. Or Gangleri, which means the wanderer or way weary. And these are all just words that just mean Odin. I forgot to mention why you might want to have all these things other than, it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to, a little bit of a riddle to refer to things by names that they don't actually, that aren't their normal common names. But if you've got such a complex set of rules to go with, and you have to have really intricate like syllable count and the alliteration has to be really good, it's good to know that I can call Odin by any of like 200 different names. I can just go through and go, okay, well, I need it to alliterate with V. So, or for instance, I need to alliterate it with Vopna, which means weapons. I want a name for Odin that has a V at the beginning of it. Oh, well, Valfother is a name for Odin. It means father of the slain. So we can use that word instead. So these heiti give you, and kennings give you a whole bunch of different ways to make your puzzle pieces fit in and make sense. And kennings do that same thing. Before I go into the kennings, though, I know this seems so back and forth, but we need to talk a little bit about the Eddas. Just a little bit about the Eddas before we go into the kennings. So I already sort of introduced, there are two works that are called the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. The Poetic Edda is a collection of poems that come from oral tradition. I did not finish when the poetry dates between line, because I put it down later. Okay, I'm gonna go through and fix this PowerPoint sometime. So these were found in the Codex Regius, which is a codex from the 13th century, and the poems themselves likely date much earlier, to the 10th century or earlier. But there's a lot of uncertainty and debate surrounding how we date each of these different poems. And the Prose Edda is a collection of stories compiled or attributed to Snorri Sturluson from the 13th century. And all of the stories and myths that are included in this volume are done so because they are vital for the understanding of kennings. And the Prose Edda is a poetry manual. Most of what we know, almost all of what we know about Old Norse mythology comes from the Prose Edda, which was written as a poetry manual. That is how deeply baked into the culture from both angles that the poetry is, and also how steeped in Viking culture. So let me say that again. Let me get my words right again. The poetry itself needs the cultural understanding to operate properly, and it's clear that the culture took its poetry very seriously, and that the poetry itself was very much baked into how Viking culture operated. Now, finally, let's talk about kennings. Let's do it. Kennings are not quite metaphors, but they're close. Whaley's definition of a kenning is nominal periphrasis consisting of a base word and one or more determinants. You might hear that and say, oh, of course, I get what that means. But for the rest of us, that basically means we're talking about a noun, and one word of our kenning is going to be the word that stands in for that noun. And that all of the other words modify that noun so we know what we're actually talking about. And yes, I knew someone was going to bring this up. Absolutely. It is very much like that Star Trek Next Gen episode where and it's so funny because I have been told about this episode and I've never seen it yet. So one of these days I got to get on that. But where apparently like a whole culture only talks in essentially kennings, where it's all metaphorical references to things. But so this is a really common English kenning, essentially. Ship of the desert, which means camels. Why? Well, ship here is our base word, right? It is the word that in the sentence structure takes the place of where camel would go. And then of the desert modifies ship, because if I just said the ship took me to Cairo, you'd be like, what where were you? When? How? Like, were you on the river? Where were you? No, the ship of the desert took me to Cairo. Now I know that a camel has taken me there, right? So that's why it's a determinant. It determines the way that the other word needs to be interpreted. In Old Norse, oftentimes that is very culturally based. You need to have understanding of myths and legends to understand what the kenning actually is referring to. So for example, the mead of poetry. Oh my goodness, there are so many times where the mead of poetry comes up, and there are so many different ways you can do it. This is a tale that comes up in the beginning of the it's found in Gylfaginning in the poetic or the prose Edda. If you'd like to read that section, it's the first section of the prose Edda. They talk about this story where Odin, long story short, steals this magical poetry, this magical mead that like is made out of the blood of a very wise guy, and he drinks it all down and he flies away and regurgitates it all back up at Asgard for the rest of the gods, and then they drink it, and now they have poetry. That's where they get the gift of poetry. Fun side note, on the way to Asgard, Odin was an eagle when he flew away. He pooped, and all bad poetry comes from the poop. So fun fact. But so in a kenning, if you want to refer to a poem or poetry in general, if you just want to say like, I am writing a poem, which is often the case. They often just start off with like, here I am composing this poem. You can use any liquid plus any sort of referring to the gods. Like if it's any liquid that belongs to any of the gods, it means the mead of poetry. So I've got, this is the Skaldic, nope, let's go back. This is loading, but this is the Skaldic Poetry database, the Skaldic Poetry Project. They've just recently revamped their website, so woo, it's pretty now. This is a list of kennings from Meissner's. I'll make sure that I add to the bibliography a couple of the names of actual text, of actual physical books that you can search for. But Meissner has a whole theory about kennings and a comprehensive list of every single kenning that we have in Old Norse and what we think it means. And this is from that list. This is any, oh, I guess I grabbed the ones for alcoholic drinks. Well, that's not what I wanted. We're going back real quick. you'll get a good look at. I have linked this in that presentation as well, so you will be able to find this. If you want to find a kenning for one of these words, if you're trying to write if you're trying to write a poem and you want to find a kenning for battle, you can just click on here and it'll give you a bunch of Old Norse examples and their English translations. So this is a super good resource as well. I was gonna find poetry, which is in the P section. There we go. So here we go. The drink of Huar. Once again, the liquid or the drink of a god, or actually, this is a giant. The giant, it belonged to the giants first, so sometimes it also might be a drink of the giants and also be poetry. So anything that sort of like refers to the story or elements of this story can help you understand, like, oh, we're talking about poetry right now. Feast of the Gods, Igor's drink, the cup liquid of the undead, the correct drink of Regan. Like, see what I'm saying? Like, strong drink of Vafadar, which is another word for Odin. Once again, there's a billion words for Odin. So this just keeps coming up. You can also, can we go bigger? You can also look at things like Jod Fenris, offspring of Fenrir. You have to know that Fenrir is the giant wolf who ends up killing Odin in Ragnarok. And then you would know an offspring of Fenrir is a wolf. Once again, another kenning for wolves, Hestan Flester Flags, many a horse of the troll woman. So horse of the troll woman, you have to know that in myths and legend, oftentimes troll women and giantesses are seen riding on the backs of wolves. So now you know, oh, a horse for a troll woman is a wolf. That's the kind of like more in-depth cultural knowledge that needs to come before you can actually understand what many kennings are talking about. Although a lot of them are just sort of in this is to that as that is to this format. Here's some more. Odin's Burr, Odin's son is Thor. Sverdsmot is swords meeting, which means battle. Sjöregen, sword rain, or the rain of swords, also means battle. Some very common kenning forms are the storm or gathering or meeting of any kind of, or clamor or chatter, any sort of like noise words of any kind of weapon, of axes, of spears, of blades, of swords. That means battle. The tree of any kind of weapon, or also sometimes the weapon of any god, means a warrior. Trees usually are stand-ins for people, and if you are talking about a man, you use a masculine form of. Old Norse has grammatical gender, so there's masculine, feminine, and neuter words, nouns. And so if you are trying to refer to a man, they tend to use a masculine gendered tree name, if that makes sense, right? So like some trees have a feminine grammatical gender, and that's what you use to describe in a kenning for a woman. Of course, in English, you cannot tell. So you would have to know Old Norse and be reading it that way to like get that, but usually from context clues, and almost always it's men. In Old Norse poetry, we are almost never talking about women, because it's a super patriarchal society. Then there's also wolf of something, or sometimes the giant of something, any kind of like, or the snake, any kind of predator or evil thing of something else. It is the enemy of that thing. For example, the wolf of the forest or the wolf of timber is fire. The enemy of wood is fire. So I wanted to do a little you try portion. I have a couple of kennings here that all are actually, so these are all, I know they look like they're one word, but they are each have two elements to them and therefore are still kennings rather than heiti. So first is Fjordjord, which means whale earth. Can anyone guess what whale earth means?
The ocean?
Absolutely, the ocean. Baugbroti is ring breaker. Does anyone know what ring breaker might be referring to?
Sword?
No, but that's that. Oftentimes, shield breaker or helm breaker. Swords are often that. Ring breaker is really tricky because you think it would be a weapon.
A liar?
A lyre, like
somebody
the instrument, or
like somebody who lies.
no? But you're getting into the right kind of realm, I think, with sort of where the thought behind that.
An oath breaker?
So in this is actually a positive term, and it's a ring breaker is someone who is giving rings away, or taking them off of their arm, and sometimes they were breaking them in pieces and giving parts of rings because of the weight or value of the metal involved. So for instance, if a silver arm ring is very heavy and you could split it in half and give someone just half of the ring. So a ring breaker is someone who is generously giving rings out, and therefore a leader or a chieftain or a king. And so even if we're not talking about actual mythology, there's a lot of like things where you just have to know how early Scandinavian culture operated. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. And then this one's a little easy again. Seilmar, which means sail, mare.
Wind?
Wind. That's a really good guess. Not quite. I think a little even easier.
How about boat? Boat.
Yep, boat, a ship. It's just a ship. The most common things that get kennings, because of course, not every topic is talked about equally. Most of the time, your kennings that you'll see are going to be for poetry, for ships, for kings, and for warriors, and for battle. Weird when you think about Vikings that they would have those be the most common. And let's take a look at some examples. I also might, yep, we're gonna take a look at this example. I'm doing good on time here. So again, this is the same verse that we were looking at earlier. This is Harald III of Norway. And this is a look, so as you can see, this was from my class last year. This is how I go through and translate the poems. So this is the same verse we saw. I've got the Old Norse bolded, and then the line beneath, I fully glossed each word. I found every single definition that it could be, and then every single grammatical position it could be referring to, because oftentimes the same look of a word might be two different declensions or a different conjugation, or sometimes, super frustratingly, a conjugation of one word, like of one verb, will be identical to a declension of a totally different noun that means a totally different thing. So you have to figure out what each one is, or what each one likely is. And then, like I told you, they are all out of order. So I think of it like I'm making a puzzle, and the first step is I flip over all the puzzle pieces and then find all the corners and edges. And that's me just translating every single word, one word at a time. And then after that, I get to actually put them together and figure out where they all fit in. This verse, I want to just point out some interesting things that are happening with it. You'll notice these sections where it's been put into parentheses. In the actual manuscript, they would not have put in those parentheses, and they also probably would not have had colons and commas or apostrophes. Although usually they ended the poem with a period. They didn't tend to write those into the actual manuscripts, and so these are all just to make it easier for a modern eye. But this section here, all of these parentheses words are a sort of separate thought that's running alongside the main poem. It's like there's basically like two sentences happening at one time, but because the word order can be all messed up, you can kind of tell where the sort of like inserted aside sentence, like a stage aside, is being put inside the poem. And this internal thing is a really cool reket kenning. And reket is when you basically chain kennings out. This is my translation of this verse. We do not creep before the commotion of weapons, which means battle. In the hollow curve of the shield, I got this wrong. My professor told me I had the wrong thing, but in the curve of the shield at the battle, here's that inserted part, which I'll skip for right now. Formerly the neck ring bearer, which is the woman who's referred to here, someone who wears neck rings, bade me to bear my helm support, which is my head, proudly, there when the ice of battle, which is a sword, and skulls met one another. I love that. Here where the ice of battle and skulls met one another in the din of metal. Again, battle. You can see how many times just kennings for battle come up in this one. Here is the inserted part about the woman, right? So the neck ring bearer bade me. What did she bade? So bade the faithful or discreet Hilder of the Hawkland. Hawkland is the arm or hand where a hawk might perch. Hilder is Valkyrie's name. It also means battle. Hilder of the hand is just is a kenning for woman. So all this whole long thing, the faithful Hilder of the Hawkland, just means the faithful woman. And that's what reket is you can just keep chaining. And I've seen kennings that have like 5 layers of complexity where you just read this absolutely nonsensical looking sentence. And you're like, what on earth? What was the Kinnahild? And I had one that was, we were trying to translate once that was like the destroyer of the moons of the bowsprit. Yeah, exactly. So destroyer is our base word, which is what our word, it's the noun that's going to be replaced in the sentence. But what on earth are the moons of the bowsprit? Well, the bowsprit is referring to a ship, as that's a Haiti, right? Bowsprit, a part referring to the whole of the ship. The moons of the bowsprit, the moons of the ship, are round things that you would find on a ship, which are the shields that you would line the edge of a ship with. So moons of the bowsprit equals shields. Destroyer of shields equals warrior. So the destroyer of the moons of the bowsprit means warrior. Yeah. Tungla rondum tungla. I'm so glad you remember. It took us like 2 hours to and I had to call up one of my old grad student friends to help us translate this one kenning. Yeah, so that's that. Here's my bibliography. And I guess it's time for questions. I'll put this back up so you guys can take a look at it. I also, yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming, everyone. I also was thinking I was going to really quickly, there was another poem. It's one of my favorites that I quickly search up. So think about questions and ask things. And I'll just put it on the screen if anyone wants to hang around because we're in the whatever time, right?
Yeah, the plan for the next 2 hours is just have everybody hang out, be social, and share their art. So I think that's
cool.
exactly what you're doing. Have at it.
Yeah. So Kennehild asked, do you have any tips for folks who may want to practice coming up with kennings? Okay. So for that, I think really like looking at Meissner's source. Let me see if I can spell his name right. Meissner. Can't remember his first name. I've just put it into the chat. Or if you look up Meissner and kennings, he literally wrote the book on kennings, and it had, like I said, it has a very extensive list of kennings and goes very deep into like how they are formed and stuff. But if you want an even easier, more accessible sort of entry point, using this just to give you kind of an idea of how they work, and then also knowing your Old Norse, or I guess whatever mythology you would like to sort of reference. Of course, there's tons of Christian Old Norse poetry that has a new sort of poetic language that has to do with Christ. So the form, I think, can be adapted to different sort of cultural backgrounds. I am sure you could think of some very funny or interesting kennings to do with, for instance, current political climates and things like that, that are based on things that we would culturally understand with what's it called? Analogies, you know, this to that. Thank you so much, Kennehild. Pulling it up. So I've just put the kennings, this page here. So if you see anything in any, this is about any noun you could come up with. They have a full list, and see some of those ship boats has 345 different kennings for it. So you can take a look at this list and get a really good sense of the typical normal patterns that come up with kennings. And I think that that'll be a pretty good starting place, if that is a good answer, Kennehild. Well, the count for battle, 600. Yeah, let's see. Oh, no, male or man has a 1,500 different kennings for it. So heavenly body, gold comes up a lot. Lots of places where the dragon sleeps for gold. Yeah. Yeah, so that's all I have. Thanks for coming to my class, everyone.
Thank you so much for teaching. That was fantastic.
Thank you. I'm gonna